You were telling me before we started rolling that there's a big change in the dynamic of this conference compared to previous ones, and maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference, now recognize I've only been at one, but I've certainly been told by my colleagues, but even the comparison with last year's council, having a federalist Premier from Quebec at the table makes a huge difference. You know, we've been able to move on issues like having everyone involved in the healthcare innovation work, having a Canadian energy strategy that includes the Premier of Quebec. It just makes a huge difference in those national discussions. You
have a lot invested in public infrastructure. Do you have a specific ask, by you I mean the province of Ontario, do you have a specific ask of the feds, and how do you think this conference helped to attain those goals?
Well, there's a perfect example in terms of my renewed relationship with Quebec. Premier Couillard and I had a conversation before we came to the council. We both agreed that this was an issue that needed to be front and center. That is an opinion shared by the table, and so I have said that I think that the fact that provinces and municipalities combined are putting about 3% of GDP into infrastructure investment, that if the federal government could step up to 2%, that's a quantum that we've put on it in Ontario. But there was unanimity around the table that the federal government needed to step up to the plate in terms of predictable, ongoing, flexible funding for infrastructure, because the federal government has said, well, we've got the Build Canada Fund. Well, yes, that's true, but it's not adequate, and it's ad hoc. We can't count on that in the long term. There's no predictability associated with that fund.
And then another issue that came out, maybe a little bit of a surprise, was the extent to which you all talked about climate change and efforts around that. Is there a summit in Quebec City next spring dealing with that? What can more talking about sort of best practices accomplish?
Well, I think that it's more than just talking about best practices. It's about understanding that this is a challenge facing us all, that we are all doing different things about it. You know, we've shut down our coal plants. BC has a carbon tax. Carbon pricing in general across the country is something that is going to be talked about and has to be talked about, and we can learn from each other in order to take action, not just so that we have an academic discussion, but that we recognize that this is our responsibility as provincial and territorial leaders. And the sharing of information and perhaps the ability to have bilateral arrangements actually strengthens all our economies, and therefore strengthens the economy of the country. We're intertwined, you know. I traveled to Alberta early on in my time as Premier to emphasize that I understood that transporting fuel across the country was in the best interest of Alberta's economy, but it's also in the best interest of Ontario's economy, because we have businesses that are tied to the oil sands. But we're going to do it in an environmentally responsible way. We're going to have the right protections in place for First Nation, Aboriginal, and all of our communities. And we're going to make sure that in addition to that discussion, we talk about innovation, clean technology, and climate change.
On healthcare, there was a lot of talk about sort of modifying the formula to account for aging populations. And you've got a particular beef, which is that when the adjustment, when the allocation of transfers went to a per capita basis, Ontario gained a lot less than Alberta did in the last couple of years. Are you asking for more altogether from the feds?
That was an interesting discussion. There wasn't unanimity on the mechanism. Mm-hmm. We all agreed that we've got an aging demographic, even in Alberta and Saskatchewan, that have the youngest populations. They still have an aging population overall, and so we're all struggling with how best to provide the service that people need and where they need it. And so Christy Clark had a particular suggestion about a fund, and that idea has been given to the Fiscal Arrangements Working Group to talk about, because it's part of the context of that fiscal imbalance between the federal government, whose reality is that they're going to be in surplus within a year or so, and the provincial realities, which is many of us are still in deficit. And so we need to arrange, we need to have an arrangement that is fair.
How much easier would these conversations be if you knew that you were going to be sitting down with the Prime Minister in 3 months?
Well, I think if there were some regularity to the communication among not just individual premiers and the Prime Minister, but us collectively, I think it would make a huge difference. I think that it would take a lot of the guesswork out of this. It would take a lot of the public and more confrontational tone out of the exchanges, and I think we could get more done. You know, I think we could come to solutions more quickly on issues. I'll give you a perfect example. The federal government has decided that provinces are not doing enough on internal trade. The reality is that internal trade is something that we were going to talk about. We did talk about it. There's a lot of work that's being done. We have the agreement on internal trade, and we're going to move forward. Well, it would have been great had the federal government had that conversation with us as a group and said, look, we're concerned about this. We think that there's more that could be done. How can we work with you to facilitate that? But instead, there's sort of a chastising tone that comes from the federal government, and I don't think it's helpful. It doesn't mean that we don't move forward as provinces and territories. We absolutely do.
While the conference was happening, your office put out polling which suggests that the distinct Ontario model for pensions might be popular across the country. Are you trying to get other provinces to take up the sort of adventure that you've embarked on?
Well, I made the presentation at the table, and I talked to my colleagues about the reality that the vast majority of people in Canada are concerned about their retirement security. You know, that's just a reality that we're facing. I made the argument, as I have done over and over, that enhancement of the Canada Pension Plan is our first choice. But I wanted to reassure and just update my colleagues on the fact that I had run on this creation of an Ontario pension plan, that we won the election, not solely because of that, but it resonated with people because they are concerned about it. We have 6 provinces and territories now sitting with us on the working group, and my hope is that we still will see the federal government take this up, and we'll see an enhancement to CPP. But if not, we're going to keep moving forward to implement the pension plan. I wasn't going to the table trying to get agreement from other provinces and territories that they would do the same thing or that they would sign on to ours. But I did want to advance the conversation and let them know where we were at.
One question about domestic Ontario politics. You inherited a minority government, you ran a minority government for perhaps longer than you had thought you might have to. And my understanding is that the summer time since your election has been devoted largely to retooling the public service to handle the demands of, to let go of the sort of day-to-day preoccupations of minority governance and to handle the demands of long-term planning. What are the long-term, medium-term challenges, the issues that your government is going to face over the whole duration of its mandate?
Well, I think we have an economic and a fiscal challenge. Right? So creation of jobs and making sure that we create the right environment for economic growth and for investment in the province and expansion of businesses in our strong sectors. That's the economic focus that we have. We have a fiscal challenge that we have to deal with, and so a lot of the reviews that are going on and the issues around collective bargaining, those have to do with constraints that are going to allow us to stay on track to eliminate the deficit by 2017-18. But all of that was laid out in our budget. We made it clear what our path was, and that's what we've been beginning to implement now.
And while we're talking about elections, there's a big one coming in a little over a year, a federal election. To what extent was this conference designed to put issues on the federal agenda as that election approaches?
Well, I think that as a federal election approaches, the delineation of issues becomes more pointed. But I think these meetings are always about how do we have the best arrangements at the provincial and at the federal level in order for economic growth in the country. I think that this meeting was very much about what is it that we are going to hear from all of the parties as we go into this federal election on these issues, on healthcare, on infrastructure investment, on the issues that are the priority for the premiers, because they are the priority for our constituents, and those constituents are the same as the constituents of the federal government.
Okay. Could we anticipate, the next conference is going to be 6 or 8 weeks before the next federal election. Would we anticipate something like a report card on federal party promises or anything like that from the premiers?
You know what, we didn't talk about that, but I'm sure that the conversation in Newfoundland Labrador will be very much about what we might expect going into the federal election.